So today is May 3rd, and the topic is the international politics of global warming or climate change. I know we're all consumed by COVID on the one hand, and on the other hand, maybe local climate issues, the fires in the hillside, the fact that we're moving into a drought if we're not already there. So I think it's a little hard to get one's brain again around sort of the international dimensions of all of this. So aside from the pandemic, which is really global in nature, but primarily because we humans move around and therefore the new viruses spread and all the rest of it. The thing about climate is that it is by definition global. And therefore, in a sense, saying international politics is wrong because international sort of designates states, right? Relations between states. And in this particular case, in having to do with climate, it's not just a question of states, but it's a question of every institution, every individual. And arguably, it is the most widespread global problematic, both scientifically and politically, that humankind has ever encountered. There have never been about 200 sovereign states. There have never been as many international institutions. There has never been the communications that we have nowadays. There's never been the ability to go deep into the sea and into outer space in the way that is taking place today. And one could arguably say there's never been a time when you had as many transnational institutions, for example, multinational and transnational organizations, who are all party and part of the problematic that we're living in, as well as the actual solutions. It's also the case that we are very close to catastrophe. Now, that's not the only time in human history when we're close to catastrophe, but the catastrophe here of the global climate is in a sense of a different magnitude. Scientists tell us that if the temperature increases by more than 1.5 centigrade between now and 2030, we will have reached the point of serious devastation of different kinds all over the world. And we're very close to that. And the argument is that if we don't reach that and we move into 2050, then we are at a level of very serious catastrophe in many ways, in the air, in the water, on the land, in terms of people. And while, as I mentioned, people, it is also the case that historically, it's not just that there haven't been 200 sovereign states. There also haven't been 10 billion people living on this planet. So the climate deniers who are saying, oh, well, over time, there have been cold periods and hot periods and so forth. Yes, but not with 10 billion people expected sometime in this century, both having to live on this planet and also generating the conditions which lead to the existential as well as the concrete reality of the great climate challenge. Now, good things and bad things have happened and are happening in terms of policy. The good thing, of course, is that the US, which admittedly only constitutes 4% of the world's population, but generates something like 15% of global warming, is now back into leadership potentially and engagement with the question of climate change. It is true that all countries in the world have to get involved, both in terms of their domestic policies towards global warming, but also are involved directly and indirectly by the consequence of what has already happened and might happen. And it's also the case that they may seem like not in the mainstream, for example, of industrial pollution, but they may very well be part and parcel of both the problems that we are having as well as the solutions, because of where they're located or what their situation is. Let me give you an example. We are dependent, I mean humans, are dependent in the world at this moment of forests, be they forests in Brazil or tropical rainforest elsewhere in the world, of absorbing much of the pollutants in the environment which create global warming. When a Brazil or an Indonesia cuts its forest and changes to farming or something else, they are no longer playing the part which we depend on to not overcome the issues, but at least control them moderately as we're moving in other directions. So in that sense, the global participation in solving the problem to some extent, as well as the global consequences of what is going on right now and continues to go on is really global in nature and has to be addressed in this particular way, even though, putting saving water savings locally and moving towards saving energy and so forth can also be done locally. But there are global dimensions to the role of the forest, the role of waterways, the role of the sea, and so forth. So everybody sort of has to get involved by default or by design, but it is still the case, of course, that important polluting countries, as well as important political actors, need to be at the forefront in mobilizing everyone. Now, when one says, for example, look, the US is per capita is creating more problems than any other country, then of course people immediately say, well, what about China? It's just like the virus, China. Well, China is in fact a problem, but it's not a per capita problem. That is to say, the individual Chinese generates less global climate change than the individual Americans, you and I. On the other hand, it is a huge country with a huge population and an industrial machinery that is still very much reliant on coal, for example. So China is a very important actor. And so without the US leadership and without the Chinese participation in addressing global warming, little countries, even if they do the right thing, can't get very far very fast. So having an international, climate change conference and treaty and setting goals and so forth is very important. And it's very important that the lead countries play a role. And as I just said, the fact that the US is back in the game is certainly a positive thing for international affairs and for international affairs linking to climate change. Let me say that it's not the only industrial country that is trying to take leadership and is in some senses doing interesting new things. We've talked in the past about the European Union, and I've mentioned, for example, in the context of COVID, the failure of the Commission of the European Union and its head, Ursula von der Leyen, to act appropriately, and that many of the COVID issues in Europe had to do with the inability of the European Commission acting appropriately in a timely fashion and organizing things for the 27 member countries. So that's been a real failure. What appears to be a real success is something which has transpired parallel to this in the last few months, which is that the European Union Commission has taken seriously its role in climate change and is trying to develop a coordinated policy for Europe, for the 27 countries, on issues of substitute energy sources, developing wind and other clean energy sources, regulating the polluting energies and so forth. And it's in a funny sort of way, while so much of the European Union seems to be fraying, in this particular area seems to be a new avenue for the European Commission, the European Union to play a role. And if this develops further, and if the European Commission can even get the East European countries on board on some of these plans, as well as coordination, what we would have on the industrial West is both the United States and Europe playing a very major role. Now, that does not mean that, you know, India or China or Nigeria has to necessarily follow suit, but there will be a lot of leverage in finance, helping to finance addressing climate issues in those countries. Also a lot of leverage of a political kind, but also considerable leverage of a technological and economic kind, because many countries are not well equipped either with the technological know-how or the economic capacity to address the questions that they themselves recognize need to be addressed. And so if sort of two industrial poles of the United States and Europe, and maybe Japan and maybe some other countries, can be talked into playing leadership roles, and one should not sell out Russia in this regard. They might themselves be pulled out into this dynamic. Some real progress might be made. Whether it's fast enough and effective enough is an open question, but it certainly is a new dynamic in international affairs that is playing itself out as people take seriously the climate challenge, which is more and more recognized as the challenge of the 21st century. So far, I've essentially talked about governments, but of course, many non-governmental organizations are also involved and can be involved and have expertise and resources. But there are sort of two other main areas. One has to do with science and technology. In many ways, it's science and technology that can tide us over a period when not adequate policies exist in various countries and or fixes don't as yet have emerged on the horizon. So for example, there's been a lot of publicity lately about the degree to which agriculture is a contributor to global warming, which indeed it is. So what can one do about it? Well, there's sort of two avenues. One is that agriculture has already been affected by global warming, and therefore, and as well as the shortage of water resources, and therefore the development of new seeds and new ways of growing things is on the agenda of what agriculture can do and needs to be done, as well as not producing things and growing things in climates that require, for example, too much water when water is not available. We should not be growing rice in the Central Valley. It should be grown where water is more available. We probably need to stop growing almonds, which require a lot of water in this part of the world. So there are shifts that can take place that husband the resources that are available. And there are scientific and development of genetic innovations that can help produce plants, for example, that require less water, that can grow in more diverse climates and so forth. So agricultural sciences can contribute a lot to making a bad situation even either slightly better or not as bad as it might become in the next decade. On the animal side, there is a similar situation, which is that, as we all know, we are meat-consuming societies in industrial countries, and much of the meat is derived from cows and pigs and chickens. Cows are a particular problem because they themselves emit methane gas, which is, if anything, more serious than carbon dioxide. So what can be done about that? Well, you can either decide people shouldn't eat beef anymore and should reduce their beef consumption, or you could figure out some way for cows to exhale less methane. And there's all kinds of research going on about this, changing the feed, for example, for cows, and then they emit so that they emit less methane. I'm just giving a sort of strewing around examples here and there of what science can do in agriculture to make it more viable so that the food production that is needed for human consumption can somehow continue under increasingly new and dire circumstances of climate change, lack of water or too much water, and the emitting of growing of plants to feed to animals that themselves don't absorb enough carbon dioxide and so forth. So there's a lot to be done about science. And when one speaks about science, one should also mention technology, because part of what innovations are being tested in various parts of the world are ways of sucking up the pollutants in the air. There are test machinery that's being developed, which absorbs carbon dioxide and methane. There are ways of thinking about having space absorb some of the products in the atmosphere, which are harmful for global warming. So science is working assiduously all over the world, I would say. And that leads me to, again, mention what I've mentioned before, is that it is foolhardy not to recognize that science and science development should not really stop at borders, that one should have, as one has had during COVID, cooperation across national borders, both in friendly and unfriendly governments. And the fact that scientists can be educated in countries other than their own, which gives them access to new technology. For example, African and Asian scientists studying in Europe and the United States, and also gives them links for future cooperative research. Now, in recent years, both in Europe and in the United States, one has reduced the number, for example, of foreign students, both at the graduate level and the undergraduate level, especially in the sciences and engineering. This is very short-sighted and very foolhardy. It may not something one thinks about when one thinks about climate change, but one ought to think about it, because if one imagines that there could be solutions, and some of them, or all of them, or many of them have to be science-based, then one might as well encourage globalization of science. Now, to some extent, of course, there are scientific institutions that are international in kind, but governments and non-scientific international institutions ought to encourage transnational and international and globalization of science to address climate change. A lot of it is happening, but it's happening, on an individual to individual basis, or small institutions here or there cooperating with other institutions. Another spin-off of this global climate challenge is that even if all the right things are done and one moves in the direction in the next 10 years, 15 years into stopping the accelerating global warming, one still has to address the issues that exist here and now and will expand in the next 9 years between now and 2030, which is not future damage, but damage that has already been done. And this too is an international and global issue. For example, the migration of people and refugees. Okay, so some of it is political in Central America, corrupt regimes, drugs, and all the rest. But some of it, and a fair amount of it, is that people in Central American rural areas simply can't make a living anymore because of climate change and because of lack of rainfall, lack of water, lack of other aspects having to do with the growing of whatever they were growing and the production of whatever they were producing. So then people want to move somewhere where they can make a living. And then you have a problem on the southern border. And then you have half of America saying, let's not have those people. Similarly, in Europe, with respect to the Middle East and Africa, and to some extent this affects us as well, many people are moving not for political reasons, although there are some, but many people are moving because the rural areas in much of the Sahel, for example, simply won't sustain agriculture anymore. So what do? People might move into urban areas, which is why you're having so many mega cities of 25, 30 million people all over the late developing societies. But it also means that people there can't find jobs, and people are risking their lives to get to North Africa, to get to Europe, to get to some place where they can live and have some hope. Now, admittedly, this is very disruptive of societies. Homogeneous societies in Europe find it very disruptive to have new people with new cultures, new religions moved in. But this sort of a disruption will accelerate the more the climate change makes it impossible for people to live and to be productive in the parts of the world in which they happen to be living. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is not just that the world is getting warmer, that the oceans are rising, that parts of the coastal areas in various countries can't sustain life anymore because of flooding. It is generally thought that within 10 or more years, a substantial population of Bangladesh can no longer live where they're living because it's low-lying terrain with much proximate water, and people will have to move inland or will move somewhere else. There are other such countries. So you have floods in some parts of the world. You have droughts in other parts of the world. You have incidences of unseasonable storms and the magnitude of storms destroying whole areas in the United States and elsewhere. So that the problem is not just down the road. The problem is that countries individually, but also collectively, need to confront that the human life as we know it is rapidly having to adjust and changing. But with a growing world population and with a shrinking of arable land and with a disruption in oceans and weather patterns, we're looking at not sort of some future, weather holocaust at the end of the century. We're looking at, in a situation where the political spin-offs of food production, of people on the move, of land where people used to live no longer be viable, confronting not just one or two countries, but a substantial number of the 200 countries in the world. And so it is very much an international problem, because even though you may be a small country somewhere and you're sort of managing and your population is not starving and you have a reasonable government, let's say, all of a sudden this land, be it Bangladesh or some island, is going to flood because oceans are rising, and they're rising as we speak, and not, you know, in the next century. So the economic disruption and the political disruption is really on a global scale. And the more that responsible governments are pushed by other responsible government, and the more the word gets around that we're all in this together, and that it's not a question of one country accusing another, and that we are having to act, the more likely it is that the process, this challenge that we're in, can, if not be erased, can at least be slowed down to some extent. So American and European leadership, and potentially Chinese and leadership, and potentially leadership by other countries, Japan and others, is not just a question of it would be nice to organize on an international basis, but it is absolutely going to be life-saving and essential. And in this case, the challenge is as much political as it is economic and scientific. And when one speaks of the political challenge here, it is not surprising that part of the political instability in some countries, authoritarian leaders, coups, the assassination or death anyway, of the recent president in Chad, all of these things are reported in our press as sort of isolated instances, you know, instability somewhere else, populist governments that aren't functioning. All of this may be true, but it should not come as a surprise that populism on the right and the left, authoritarianism here and there, and more centralization is in part already the consequence of the dire circumstances that are economic and social that are being visited upon various states. Let's take an industrial country illustration of this. It is not surprising that populists in various European industrial countries are screaming, we don't want, you know, all these foreigners come to our country. And we want to be left alone. Well, this global challenge of climate change says it can't be left alone. And those people very often are, dare I say, ignorant of the fact that there are reasons why people are on the move. And even when they go to countries where they don't speak the language or where they're not welcome, they generally think they're going to be better off than literally dying in their own country because their farms are not functioning, their governments don't have the resources to support them when they're unemployed. So that the political consequences for domestic countries is also very serious. And I think it would be useful, not just for the Biden administration, but for the European Union leadership, as well as leadership in various industrial countries, to acknowledge that addressing some of the political issues that their citizens are concerned about has to go hand in hand with addressing these dire existential issues that we're confronting in this society, and that they're not separate or separable in most instances. So this may not be the last time we're going to have to talk about this, because there are, of course, many new things that will happen, cataclysmic events, glaciers disintegrating, water rising, you know, all kinds of things that will get worse and that will have to be specific policy, have to have specific policy directions. But I just really wanted to sort of lay out the land and say, this is not just the kind of topic for climate scientists. This is a topic for everybody. This is a topic for all countries. And while I have mentioned international institutions as well as governments, I want to end by saying that businesses, multinational corporations, for example, also have to be drawn in. There are, for example, some oil companies which are doing research and in fact installing non-pollution sources of energy, and there are big advances being made with battery to save the energies that, for example, wind produces so they can be used later and so forth. But there are also multinational corporations which aren't exactly on board. And let me end with one story. There is a mess in Myanmar, as we all know. The military has taken over. It's shooting its own population. Everybody is pulling their hair out, including all ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, to try to get the military to act more reasonably, and or for countries individually and collectively to censor the military regime and sanction it in such a way that it can't operate very effectively anymore in its own country. Well, then there's the Chevron Corporation, which is the dominant corporation producing energy in Myanmar, oil and gas, I believe. And it is largely managed, it is managed technologically by Chevron, but the political input is at the moment the military, and the military is in control. And so what does Chevron do? It tries to support the military because that's how it can continue to function in Myanmar as it's been functioning. So you have a situation here where a Western corporation, which should know better than support a military regime, is supporting it because its bread and butter is extracting the energy resources in Myanmar, and it doesn't particularly concern itself with the fact that it is also supporting a military regime, which is not only violating the human rights of its people, but isn't doing anything useful in many other walks of life, including climate change and so forth. So you can see that a single corporation, but there are others, can undermine the economic and the scientific and the political forward-looking steps and policies. And so corporations, in a sense, have to become party. Some have, I don't want to smear them all, but some have not. And it is beholden, it seems to me, for the industrial countries whose corporations they mostly are, though not entirely, there's some Chinese ones as well, some Indian ones, to put a heavy hand on the activities of those corporations, not only with respect to energy and developing clean energy, but also to the political role that they might be playing, which would undermine not only human rights, but also undermine sensible activities in the field of climate change. Be well and see you in 2 weeks.